Flavored.
Flavored.
Flavored coffees.
Flavorful. Flavorful.
Flavorful cheese.
Flavoring.
Flavoring.
Artificial flavorings.
Flavorsome.
Flavorsome.
A flavorful Mexican dish.
Flaw.
Flaw.
A flaw in the software.
A slight flaw in the glass.
A design flaw caused the engine to explode.
Beautiful scenery does not make up for the flaws of this film. There is a fundamental flaw in Walton's argument.
Jealousy is Othello's major flaw.
The president's character flaws.
Flawed.
Flawed.
A flawed concept.
The research behind this report is seriously flawed.
Flawless.
Flawless. Adrian's flawless French.
Flax.
Flax.
Flaxen.
Flaxen.
Flay.
Flay. She was well known for flaying public officials in her daily column.
Flea.
Flea. Are you sure the dog has fleas? Flea bag.
Flea bag.
Flea collar.
Flea collar.
Flea market.
Flea market.
Flea pit.
Flea pit.
Fleck.
Fleck.
A black beard with flecks of grey.
Flecks of sawdust.
Flecked.
Flecked.
Red cloth flecked with white. Fledged.
Fledged.
Fledgling.
Fledgling. Fledgling.
A fledgling republic.
Flee.
Flee.
His attackers turned and fled. Massari spent 6 months in prison before fleeing the country.
Many German artists fled to America at the beginning of World War II.
Fleece.
Fleece.
Fleecy.
Fleecy.
Fleecy white towels.
Fleet.
Fleet.
The U.S. 7th Fleet.
A fleet of taxis.
Atalanta was fleet of foot.
Fleet admiral.
Fleet admiral.
Fleeting.
Fleeting.
A fleeting smile.
For one fleeting moment, Paula allowed herself to forget her troubles. I caught a fleeting glimpse of them as they drove past. I caught a fleeting glimpse of them as they drove past. Carol was paying a fleeting visit to Paris.
Fleet Street.
Fleet Street.
Flemish.
Flemish.
Flesh.
Flesh.
A freshwater fish with firm white flesh.
His flesh was red and covered in sores.
Cut the melon in half and scoop out the flesh. Cut the melon in half and scoop out the flesh.
He looked much shorter in the flesh than on television.
The way he stared at her made her flesh creep. How can he treat his own flesh and blood that way?
I'll try to put some flesh on the plan Margaret has outlined.
You need to flesh out your argument with a few more examples. Flesh-coloured.
Flesh-colored.
Flesh-coloured tights. Flesh pots.
Flesh pots.
Flesh wound.
Flesh wound.
Fleshy.
Fleshy.
The fleshy part of your hand. A plant with fleshy leaves. Flu.
Flu.
Flex.
Flex.
The role will allow her to flex her acting muscles.
Flexibility.
Flexibility.
Employees expect flexibility in the workplace.
Stretching exercises will help your flexibility. Flexible.
Flexible.
We can be flexible about your starting date.
Our new computer software is extremely flexible.
The government needs a more flexible approach to education.
Shoes with flexible rubber soles.
Flexi time.
Flexi time.
Flick.
Flick.
Papa flicked the ash from his cigar.
The cow's tail flicked from side to side.
Jackie flicked her long hair back. I felt inside the doorway and flicked the light switch.
Sandra flicked the TV on. Leith flicked a glance at her watch. The old man flicked his whip and the horses moved off.
Will flicked through Carla's photo album. With a flick of the wrist, Fry sent the ball into the opposite court.
I can shut off all the power in the building at the flick of a switch.
An action flick.
I had a quick flick through your report.
Flicker.
Flicker.
The overhead lights flickered momentarily. A puzzled smile flickered across the woman's face. A puzzled smile flickered across the woman's face. Polly's eyelids flickered, then she slept.
The flicker of the firelight. She saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes.
Flick knife.
Flick knife.
Flyer.
Flyer.
Flight.
Flight.
He immediately booked a flight to Toulouse.
There are only 3 flights a day to Logan Airport from Heathrow.
Pelicans in flight. Pelicans in flight.
In 1968, the first supersonic airliner took flight. In 1968, the first supersonic airliner took flight. During its flight, the weapon twists and turns. During its flight, the weapon twists and turns.
Bert lives 2 flights down from here. Bert lives 2 flights down from here.
She fell down a whole flight of stairs.
Donald Wood's hasty flight from South Africa early in 1978.
When the alarm sounded, the whole gang took flight.
A flight of swallows.
Flight attendant.
Flight attendant.
Flight crew.
Flight crew.
Flight deck.
Flight deck.
Flightless.
Flightless.
A flightless bird.
Flight lieutenant.
Flight lieutenant.
Flight path.
Flight path.
Flight recorder.
Flight recorder.
Flight sergeant.
Flight sergeant.
Flight simulator.
Flight simulator.
Flighty.
Flighty.
Flimflam.
Flimflam.
I was sick of his intellectual flimflam.
Flimsy.
Flimsy.
A flimsy cotton dress.
A flimsy wooden building.
A flimsy alliance between the 2 tribal groups.
The evidence against him is extremely flimsy. A flimsy excuse.
Flinch.
Flinch.
She flinched at the touch of his hand. The boy flinched away from him.
Jo flinched at her sister's insensitivity.
He never flinched from doing his duty.
Fling.
Fling.
He flung the box into the river.
People cheered and flung their hats into the air. People cheered and flung their hats into the air.
He flung his coat over the back of the chair. He flung his coat over the back of the chair.
She flung back the covers and got up. He flung the books aside angrily.
He grabbed her arm and flung her to the ground. He flung himself down on the bed.
She flung her arms around Louise.
People were flinging all sorts of accusations at her.
His own words were flung back at him.
The door was flung open and Selkirk entered.
Opposition leaders were flung into jail.
After the divorce, he flung himself into his work to forget her.
He flung himself at her and snatched the bag. The children flung themselves at him, squealing with joy.
He flung off his coat.
He was flung out of school for swearing at a teacher.
If it doesn't work, just fling it out.
They had a brief fling a few years ago.
He sees this as his final fling before he retires.
Flint.
Flint.
Flinty.
Flinty.
Duval gave him a flinty stare.
Flip.
Flip.
He flipped the top off the bottle and poured himself a drink. She flipped the lid of the box open and looked inside.
He flipped the paper over and started writing on the back. We flipped a coin to see who would go first.
There's quite an art to flipping pancakes.
I just flipped and started shouting.
Anna flipped the switch that opened the front gate. Josie flipped on the radio.
He picked up the newspaper and flipped straight to the sports pages. I flipped through my address book but couldn't find her phone number.
Mom flipped her lid when she found out I was pregnant.
In the end, the decision was made by the flip of a coin.
I tripped and almost did a backward flip down the stairs.
I had a quick flip through my cookery books and found a recipe that sounded quite nice.
I was fed up with his flip comments.
Flip chart.
Flip chart.
Flip chip. Flip chip. Flip chip technology.
Flip-flop.
Flip-flop. An incredible political flip-flop.
Flip-flops.
Flip-flops.
Flippant.
Flippant.
A rather flippant remark.
You shouldn't be flippant about such things.
This is no time for flippancy. Flipper.
Flipper.
Flip phone.
Flip phone.
Flipping.
Flipping.
It's flipping cold outside.
This flipping pen doesn't work.
Flip side.
Flip side.
The flip side of the treatment is that it can make patients feel very tired.
Flirt.
Flirt.
She accused him of flirting with other women.
She was flirting outrageously with some of the managers. He had flirted with the idea of emigrating.
Climbers enjoy flirting with danger.
She's an incorrigible flirt.
Flirtation. He started his own business last year, after a brief flirtation with political life.
She had no objection to a little mild flirtation.
She had a brief flirtation with Tim.
Flirtatious.
Flirtatious.
She gave him a flirtatious smile. A flirtatious giggle.
Flit.
Flit.
Birds flitted about in the trees above them.
She seemed to spend her life flitting from one country to another. His eyes flitted to his watch.
Float.
Float.
I wasn't sure if the raft would float.
She spent the afternoon floating on her back in the pool.
A couple of broken branches floated past us.
The logs are trimmed and then floated down the river.
I looked up at the clouds floating in the sky.
Leaves floated gently down from the trees.
The sound of her voice came floating down from an upstairs window. Rachel floated around the bedroom in a lace nightgown. We first floated the idea back in 1992. Russia decided to float the ruble on the foreign exchange market.
The company will be floated on the stock market next year.
You can add raisins, nuts, chocolate chips, whatever floats your boat.
There's a lot of cash floating around in the economy at the moment.
We stood and watched the carnival floats drive past.
Flotation.
Flotation.
Floating.
Floating.
You can choose either a fixed or floating interest rate for the loan.
The area has a large floating population.
Floating voter.
Floating voter.
Flock.
Flock.
A flock of small birds.
A flock of children.
People have been flocking to the exhibition.
Tourists flock to see the town's medieval churches and buildings. Tourists flock to see the town's medieval churches and buildings.
Flow.
Flow.
Flog.
Flog.
He was publicly flogged and humiliated.
I'm going to flog all my old videotapes.
They take a good idea and flog it to death.
Flogging.
Flogging.
Flood.
Flood.
Towns and cities all over the country have been flooded. The houses down by the river flood quite regularly.
There are now fears that the river could flood.
Refugees are still flooding across the border.
Donations have been flooding in since we launched the appeal.
A plan to flood the country with forged banknotes.
We've been flooded with offers of help.
Car manufacturers have been accused of flooding the market with cheap cars. Car manufacturers have been accused of flooding the market with cheap cars.
Light flooded into the kitchen.
The morning sun flooded the room with a gentle light.
I felt happiness and relief flooding over me.
Memories of my time in Paris flooded back. Memories of my time in Paris flooded back.
The village was cut off by floods.
The worst floods for over 50 years.
The UN appealed for help with the flood of refugees crossing the border.
She came downstairs in floods of tears. Floodgate.
Floodgate. If this case is successful, it could open the floodgates for thousands of similar claims.
There are fears that the floodgates will open and a large number of parents will take their children out of school.
His display of kindness to her opened the floodgates again, and she began to sob loudly.
Flooding.
Flooding.
The heavy rain has led to serious flooding in some areas.
The riverbanks have been built up to prevent flooding.
Floodlight.
Floodlight.
The church was lit up by floodlights.
The game will be played under floodlights.
Floodlit.
Floodlit.
A floodlit football pitch.
Floodplain.
Floodplain.
Flood tide.
Flood tide.
Floodwater.
Floodwater.
Floor.
Floor.
A polished wooden floor.
A puddle of water on the kitchen floor.
A warehouse that has 410,000 square feet of floor space.
A ground floor flat.
Our office is on the top floor.
We are located on the 7th floor of the building.
Creatures that live on the ocean floor.
There were 2 or 3 couples already on the dance floor.
Everyone took to the floor for the last waltz.
He wasn't keen on the idea of working on the shop floor.
The busy trading floor.
Manufacturers have tried to put a floor under the price of their products.
Are there any questions from the floor?
The delegates crowded the floor of the House.
The chairman then took the floor. He stepped aside to allow other speakers to have the floor. He stepped aside to allow other speakers to have the floor.
Share prices have gone through the floor.
A couple of the questions completely floored me.
He was floored in the first round of the fight.
I got into the car and floored it.
Floorboard.
Floorboard.
I lifted the carpet to check the floorboards for woodworm.
Flooring.
Flooring.
We've chosen wood flooring for the hall.
Vinyl flooring. Floor lamp.
Floor lamp.
Floor length.
Floor length.
Floor-length curtains.
A floor-length skirt.
Floor plan.
Floor plan.
Floor show.
Floor show.
Floor time. Floor time.
Floozy.
Floozy.
Flop.
Flop.
He flopped down onto the bed.
I got home and flopped in front of the TV.
His head flopped back pathetically.
The film was a complete flop. He fell with a flop into the water.
Flophouse.
Flophouse.
Floppy.
Floppy.
A floppy hat.
A dog with long floppy ears.
Floppy disk.
Floppy disk.
Flora.
Flora.
tourism is damaging the flora and fauna of the island.
Floral.
Floral.
A scarf with a bold floral pattern.
A pretty floral dress.
A light floral fragrance.
There were floral tributes from his colleagues.
Florid.
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 A middle-aged man with a florid complexion.
A book written in a very florid style.
Florin.
Florin.
Florist.
Florist.
Floss.
Floss.
Flotation.
Flotation.
The company has decided to postpone its flotation on the stock market.
Flotation tank.
Flotation tank.
Flotilla.
Flotilla.
Flotsam.
Flotsam.
He would walk along the beach collecting the flotsam and jetsam that had been washed ashore.
Works of art made from the flotsam and jetsam of everyday life.
Camps were set up to shelter the flotsam and jetsam of the war.
Flounce.
Flounce.
She flounced out of the room.
The dress had red satin flounces at the bottom.
She walked off with a flounce. Flounced.
Flounced.
A flounced skirt.
Flounder.
Flounder.
I found myself floundering as I tried to answer her questions.
I'm sorry, she floundered helplessly. More and more firms are floundering because of the recession.
They were floundering chest-deep in the freezing water. I could hear them floundering around in the dark.
Flower.
Flower.
Roll the pastry out on a lightly floured board.
Flourish.
Flourish.
The economy is booming and small businesses are flourishing. Most plants will flourish in the rich, deep soils here.
She walked quickly to the desk, flourishing her checkbook.
He opened his wallet with a flourish and took out a handful of notes.
There's nothing like a luxurious dessert to give a menu a final flourish.
They finished the season with a flourish, winning their last 3 matches.
A flourish of trumpets.
Flowery.
Flowery.
She wiped her floury hands on her apron.
Flout.
Flout.
Some companies flout the rules and employ children as young as 7.
The union had openly flouted the law.
Flow.
Flow.
He struggled to swim against the flow of the water.
I tied a towel round his leg to try to stem the flow of blood.
A new road system to improve traffic flow through the city centre. A new road system to improve traffic flow through the city centre.
The flow of funds from the US to Europe.
There has been a steady flow of people leaving the area. They have accused the government of trying to block the free flow of information, an attempt to stem the flow of refugees across the border.
I didn't want to interrupt her flow, so I said nothing.
The ebb and flow of the tide.
I don't mind. I'll just go with the flow.
These gates regulate the amount of water flowing into the canal. These gates regulate the amount of water flowing into the canal. If the windows are shut, air cannot flow freely through the building.
Money has been flowing into the country from Western aid agencies.
The number of refugees flowing into the area is still increasing.
The new one-way system should help the traffic to flow better. The new one-way system should help the traffic to flow better.
Beer and whiskey flowed freely as the evening wore on.
Everyone was relaxed and the conversation flowed freely. We watched the tide ebb and flow.
She felt hot rage flowing through her.
Her long hair flowed down her back.
The political consequences that flowed from this decision.
Flowchart.
Flowchart.
Flower.
Flower.
A lovely rosebush with delicate pink flowers.
Fields full of beautiful wild flowers. He wasn't interested in growing flowers in the garden.
She bent down and picked a flower.
The first night we met, he gave me a bunch of flowers.
A beautiful flower arrangement.
It was May, and the apple trees were all in flower. Roses start to come into flower in June.
Young men killed in the flower of their youth.
Bulbs that you plant in the autumn should flower the following spring. Bulbs that you plant in the autumn should flower the following spring.
The economic and social conditions that will allow democracy to flower.